embarrassed yourself with a mistaken identity? I did that some years ago. We were invited to a very posh gathering. We were flown to another city and we were told we were going to be met by a limousine and there would be people there to meet us. And I was kind of out of my element. I don't usually get to ride in a limousine. And so when we got off at the airport, most people were dressed quite casually, but there was this very nice man who was dressed in a suit and a white shirt and a tie, very similar to what many of the helpers around the airport were dressed like, because most of the passengers were like us in fairly casual attire. And so, assuming that he was what I thought he was, when he said to me, "Are you part of the party who are going to this hotel?" I said, "Oh yes, our bags are right there if you can show us to the car." And so he kind of harumphed and picked up the bags and walked towards the car. Another woman went with us. He opened the door. She got in the car. And have you ever seen somebody who's trying not to laugh? Who is, you know, I noticed that as she got in the car. And then we got in the car. And then so did he. I had not recognized Major General Richard Romer. He, however, was not amused at me thinking that he was a porter. His wife thought it was hilarious. But I looked at those appearances and made an assumption that he was much less than I don't think a porter's less than a general, but you know, in social strata, that he was in a very different place than I expected him to be. And you know, as silly as that was, it's the kind of mistake we sometimes make at Christmas. We love the picture of the baby in the manger. And even people who never come to church or don't observe Christmas, they'll put a manger or a nativity in their home. And you know what? That picture of Jesus in the manger is absolutely amazing. To think and understand that the God of all the universe would allow himself to be carried in the womb of a peasant girl, maybe 14, 15 years old, that he would be willing to be born, displaced from his home, willing to be born to an adoptive father. Why? So that he would share our humanity, so he would be like one of us, because he gave up his pride for that. He gave up the glory that he was rightly his for that, and did it not because somebody made him carry the suitcases, but out of pure, unmitigated love. And we need to sit with that and, like Mary, ponder that. How much love did it take for the Father to allow his Son to come, knowing what was going to happen? And how much love did it take for the Son to limit himself to a baby that was totally dependent? But you know, if we stop there, we miss so much that God has for us. Have you ever noticed that very few people celebrate, who are non-Christians, and I'm not meaning this in a judgmental way, it's just an observation, that when it comes to Easter, we see primarily bunnies and Easter eggs. You know, one time I went looking for some coloring things for children, and I could not find a single thing on our education board's page that had anything except Easter bunnies and Easter eggs. Because you see, that baby in the manger is so much less dangerous than the Jesus on the cross. Oh, we'll wear crosses. We do that. But the Jesus on the cross is so much less dangerous than the Jesus who breaks out of the tomb. The Jesus who has the power of life and death. The Jesus who came so that he could live among us. The Jesus who came so that we could know who he was truly. We have seen him, said John last night. He was the glory of God. You see, when we leave him as a sweet baby in the manger, he's pretty safe. He doesn't affect our lives from day to day. But the Jesus who died and rose again, he has a call on us to be witnesses to that power, to be those who are his disciples, who follow him, those who allow our hearts to be transformed by him, those who have the courage to hope that his work can change our world. Our son and I were talking this morning about how hopeless it seems when we look at Bethlehem today. How hard it is to think that there can be any resolution there. And yet I was remembering that when that conflict started, we had a very small little prayer meeting here, and I struggled to find any sort of hope that we could pray for. And then I stood right there. I stood here, there were a few people gathered, and I looked around me and I realized suddenly that people have prayed here for some sort of peace to be achieved for how many wars? In this very place for 400 years. People have prayed for a resolution to war after war after war after war. When there was no clear path forward, when there was no hope that we could see, and yet, who would have thought in 1939 that Germany would become a friend of the West? They're the North American nations. Who would have thought that Japan would become a trading partner? We could not have predicted that. And yet, it happened. And so, on that day, several months ago, October 10, we were able to pray here with hope because we believe the God who came and lived in the manger is the God who lives the power of the resurrection in our lives, who has the power to change our lives. Have you ever wondered what happened to the shepherds? What were their lives like when they went back? They still had to tend their sheep. They still were out in the cold at night, and they still were dirty and smelly a lot of the time, because sheep, if you've ever been around them, are very sweet to look at far away, but not too good smelling when you're real close to them. Do you know that some years ago I was in Bethlehem, and I met a Palestinian Christian there. He was a shopkeeper. And again, being a little bit naive, I said to him, were your families converts to Christianity? Have you always been Christians? Assuming that they might have been Muslim before, because that's primarily, there are many Palestinians who are in Bethlehem. And he looked at me and he said, "Excuse me, madam, but I can trace my lineage back to the shepherds who stood by that cradle." Now, I don't know how true that claim was. I believe it was. But there are Christians today living in Bethlehem, as there have been every year in the 2,000 plus years since the birth of Christ. We are called to love and wonder and ponder all of the beauty around that manger scene. But we are called to so much more. We are called to live as friends, as children, as close companions of the God of all the universe, who had the power not only, who had the humility to be born in a manger, and the power to burst the bonds of death, and the promise that he would live among us. And that is our hope this morning. Amen. I invite you to please stand. On page 11, this is not the traditional creed, but it's one that I love to use at Christmas. It is not true that creation and the human family are doomed to destruction and loss. This is true. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have everlasting life. It is not true that we must accept inhumanity and discrimination, hunger and poverty, death and destruction. This is true. Jesus came that we and all who trust him may have life and have that abundantly. It is not true that violence and hatred should have the last word, and that war and destruction rule forever. This is true. Unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder. And his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, the Everlasting Prince of Peace. It is not true that we are simply victims of the powers of evil who seek to rule the world. This is true. To Jesus was given authority in heaven and on earth, and lo, he is with us, even to the end of the world. It is not true that we have to wait for those who are specially gifted, who are the prophets of the church, before we can be peacemakers. This is true. God has promised that I will pour out my Spirit on all flesh, and your sons and daughters shall prophesy, your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall have dreams. It is not true that our hopes for liberation of mankind, of justice, of human dignity, of peace, are meant for this earth and for this history. This is true. The hour comes and is now that the true worshipers shall worship God in spirit and in truth. So let us live our Christian faith in hope, even hope against hope. Let us see visions of love and peace and justice. Let us affirm with humility, with joy, with faith, with courage, Jesus Christ, the light of the world.